Thanks for tuning in to the Just Go Play podcast, where we look to develop and promote a positive youth sports experience. As always, we are available for speaking and private engagements and can be reached at info@justgoplay.ca. You can also catch full video versions of our podcast on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to visit us at justgoplay.ca. Enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Just Go Play podcast. I'm Daryl Devonish. I'm your host, also known as Coach D. Today, we have a great episode for you. In fact, this show might go down in history as one of the best shows ever. Now, I don't want to put any pressure on it, but I'm so excited. We are here today with Kim Davis, Senior Vice President at the NHL National Hockey League, in charge of social impact, growth initiatives, and legislative affairs. Last month, she was featured in Sports Illustrated as one of the most powerful women in sports. Kim, a true trailblazer, also recognized not just in sports, but as one of the most influential women in North America. Yes, people, North America. And she's on the Just Go Play podcast. Kim, how you doing?
I'm hanging in there, Coach D. How are you doing? So nice to be here with you.
Well, listen, first of all, I'm so happy you took some time out of your day. I know how busy you are, so thank you for being here. We have a million questions, but we're not going to ask a million. Won't get all to them. But before we start, can you just so the audience gets a little bit of a backstory about you, can you share a little bit about how you became an NHL executive? Like, and how did you get to this place in your life? Like, this is amazing. How did this happen?
Well, I'm still trying to figure that out myself, Coach D. No, all jokes aside, it's an amazing story and a continuing journey, and I'm happy to share it because I think it gives an example and hopefully some inspiration for young people to think about the future of their careers in sports. I started on my career journey many years ago, over 35 years ago, began my career in insurance and financial services. So I have a financial sort of base, moved into banking in the mid 80s, late 80s with Chase Manhattan Bank, large global bank, and began a succession of mergers and acquisitions over the next 20 years, and used that career path as an opportunity to pivot and to adjust my career in various areas, from finance to private banking to human resources and marketing. And ultimately, before I retired from JP Morgan in 2012, I was the president of the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, which was the third largest foundation in the world, gave $300 million away a year. Retired and went to a consulting firm, which is how the story with the NHL began. I was part of a project that Teneo was doing for the NHL, and as a result of that, had an opportunity to meet Commissioner Bettman. And frankly, he took a chance on me, and I say that not a chance in terms of my skills and competencies, because clearly he believed, and I know I bring an important skill set, but a chance in terms of someone who had no background, no history in the sport of hockey, to be able to contribute at the most senior levels of the organization. And that was 3 years ago. And it has been nothing but support from the commissioner. And I think it truly provides inspiration for young people to know that you don't have to start in sport to end in sport. You don't have to play sport to have a career in sport. So these are all the things that we want to provide and for our young people to see that both on and off the ice in hockey, there's just so many opportunities for them to reach for the stars.
Wow. When you say they took a chance on you, you took a chance on them too.
I guess that's true.
I like how you framed it, right? Like, my next question then would be, like, what attracts you to this role? Like, the NHL, has always lacked diversity. Like, what made you think you could come here and make a difference?
You know, in an area where people saw nothing but obstacles, i.e. lacking diversity, and some saying that it wasn't a sport that was for Black and brown kids, I saw that as nothing but opportunity. I have always operated in places and spaces that seem to be challenging for some particular audience. And, you know, I think what I'm good at is being a change agent and helping people understand how to identify opportunities where there might be obstacles. So it was a challenge for me, number one. Number two, I'd had an unsatisfying experience some years before with my son playing the sport of hockey when he was in school. And I just felt like there should never be any sport, particularly, where every kid doesn't feel welcomed and that it's something for them. And so for the opportunity for me to come full circle and to influence the sport of hockey where my son didn't have a satisfying experience was to me an opportunity. And thirdly, and most importantly, 8 weeks ago, my daughter had our first grandchild, a son, little Liam. And I want to make sure that I leave hockey in a place that is going to be welcoming for Liam. You know, when I'm long gone, I want Liam to, if he chooses, to be able to do whatever he wants to do, including play hockey, without fear of it not being a sport that's for him as a child of color.
That's huge. And you know what? You, amongst so many other people, have had their experience, good, bad, with hockey. And it's nice to see that you're doing something about it, like doing something big. Like I know people that have had one bad experience and they go around bad mouthing hockey, like, and then they meet me, who I play hockey, and it's done so much for me, and I've learned so much about the game. It's opened so many doors for me. And they're like, how did you have that experience when this was what my experience? So I kind of nullify these guys' experience when I say, well, listen, I had some support, I had some help, but my goal is trying to change people's views, like
yes.
on what hockey could be, and
yes.
you have to show these guys that, listen, it's not like that for everyone. Maybe back then there was some problems, but the community's changing. You can feel it changing, and I often tell people, I met you when you first started. Rob Kinezrek introduced me to you, and at that time you were taking on, you were sort of just surveying the landscape and asking lots of questions. And I felt sorry for you for a second. I said, I don't know if this lady knows what she got into here. I have no, obviously she hasn't been around hockey a long time, right? And that's why to see what you've done in the 2-3 years you've been there is amazing. And I just wanted to let the audience know that I saw you back then when you were coming into this.
Well, you probably aren't the only person that had those same feelings and also felt sorry for me. I could see on faces of so many people that I would meet as I was, collecting my data and, trying to understand the landscape, as you said, people looking at me like, she's crazy. She doesn't know what she's getting into.
What she's getting into, yeah. 100%.
But
yeah.
I do. I'm patient, and I have also worked in an industry not dissimilar to hockey that has some deep and rich traditions that had to shift and change with the times. And so I've seen this before, and I know that change is possible.
See, that's the confidence I love that you have. Like, and that's what I got when I first met you. When I first met you, I was worried, and after we finished talking, I had hope. I had hope, and you've come this far. Like, and I know there's a long road ahead. There's a lot of work to be done. So back to, just so I can stay on track. How has Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, influenced the NHL?
Yeah.
You probably get this question all the time because people are always asking you questions, but in your own words, what have you seen? How has it influenced the NHL?
Yes. What I often say when I get that question, and you know, I'm really consistent about this because I truly believe it, is that the murder of George Floyd and all that it has come as a result of that and post that has really been an acceleration point for the NHL. And I say acceleration point because it is catapulted us into work that we have been absolutely rigorously undergoing for a long time, but in a very deep way over the 2.5 years that I've been with the league. And so the moment of that dreadful, you know, just a global understanding of what those of us who our lived experience is of living in Black and brown bodies experience every day, the global nature of us all being on pause and seeing that and understanding that, I think led to a deeper awareness within the hockey community about the importance of standing up and being allies. And you know, people often want to compare hockey to the NBA, more the NBA than any other sport. And I say to them, we should absolutely have the highest standards for what should be accomplished in our sport. But we have to understand it within the context of our culture and our makeup. 93% of hockey players are non-people of color. And so for us to change the culture of hockey is going to require building education and allyship with that 93%. That means we have to make people understand what our lived experience feels like them emotionally. And I was so happy to see so many of our white players, you know, players from all over the world, because remember, 32% of our NHL players are from outside of North America.
Right.
So many of them understanding that this issue that we're talking about now is a human rights issue, that no one should be denied any kind of opportunity or treated less than because of the color of their skin. It really is that simple and basic. And so to be able to begin to get to the hearts and minds of our players and to have them lead this activation and activism is what my hope is. And I'm very encouraged by what I've seen over the past couple of months.
Wow. Yeah, I can't agree with you 100%. That piece we said, awareness, like it was like in everyone's face that we got to do something. We really got to do something. And I think even I feel it around here in Canada, around hockey, something that incident caused a switch in how
Yes.
people sort of look at hockey and how they treat people and how they treat each other. You know, that being said, there's something like there was an article you about hockey is indeed for everyone, our vision. I want to touch on that a little bit. And there's something you say, and you were just kind of talking about it just now, cultural availability. I heard you speak at the GTHL summit, and you talked about cultural availability. Can you expand a little bit on? And then we'll talk a little bit about the article, because I was like, that everyone needs to hear this. And you don't have to give the full story, but you give the Cole's notes of, because I'd never heard anyone use that word, or I feel like you coined the phrase. So, cultural availability. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. You know, when I started with NHL and I was going around, as you said, and you had this experience when we first met, collecting data and listening to the voices of stakeholders across really the world. What kept coming up, which was perplexing for me, was this idea that the reason that kids of color, for the most part, don't play the sport of hockey is because it's expensive, they don't have access to ice, and they don't have access to equipment. And yet the data, the facts were saying something else. The facts were saying, number one, for sure in Canada, that wasn't the experience, where kids didn't have access to ice, because kids had access to ice all over the place, all over the country. And yet that many were still saying that they didn't feel welcomed in the sport, number one. Number two, equipment. Look, we discard more equipment than anything across North America. And so smart individuals who understand the sport could very easily find ways, and we are doing this already, as you know, to repurpose equipment so kids would have access to it. So all of those things that were supposedly the deterrents to kids playing were they weren't showing up. Not to say that those aren't issues. I'm not discounting those.
No, I get that.
But they weren't really the driving issues. What I was hearing from families and kids was that the sport of hockey doesn't speak to me and my family. We don't feel the connection. We don't feel the aspiration of wanting this to be our sport. We don't see representation of people that look like us. And we don't see the expression of our cultures manifesting themselves in the sport of hockey. How our food and our music and our cultural availability is expressed. It's not in the sport of hockey. And that's when this term cultural availability came to light. What we were hearing was that, yes, all of those barriers exist, but the sport isn't culturally available to me. I don't feel like I can grab onto it and have it be my own. And even those like yourself, passionate about the sport and the sport having done so much for them throughout their lives, there was still something missing about the sport speaking to their souls, the way other sports spoke to other people's souls, and the way, frankly, you hear white players talk about how hockey has spoken to their souls since they were little. And so this terminology around cultural availability is, how do we ensure that we bring what we're now calling the CARE framework, which is connection, aspiration, representation, and expression for people of color into the sport of hockey. And people really can embrace that, and they can understand that in very concrete terms.
Wow. So hearing that, the money thing too, the money, I often hear it's the money. And it's almost like, and this is my own inside joke. People used to say, that's the, don't show little kids ponies. Don't show little kids ponies. How come? Because if you show them the pony, you got to afford all the riding, the horse. So don't show them the pony because you can't afford it. It's too expensive. So that's, for me, my own personal experience, the money thing, I started off playing floor hockey. And then I started to grow and love the sport, watch it on TV. And then I begged my mom, you got to sign me up. You got to sign me up. I bugged her. She's like, I don't know anything about hockey. And signed me up. And I never looked back. And to this day, she'll look back and say, that's probably the best thing I ever did for you. Signed you up for that hockey, because kept me out of trouble, got me an education. And as you said, I made it available for me, like cultural available. I introduced my Trinidadian family to hockey.
Yes.
Because they didn't know anything about it.
Yes.
And they had to come watch me play.
Yes.
And they learned.
Yes.
So
yes.
I hear that, and I think people need to see it to be it. And this is where I think we got about 40 players of color in the NHL right now.
47.
47, good. And, not just players, referees, coaches, they need to see themselves and you mentioned that. And if I know in growing up, if you don't see doctors and lawyers and bankers, it's hard to think, well, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker. But if
some kids don't know anything about it.
Exactly. So when you see someone and you're like, you're a hockey player, how do and someone that looks like them say, how did you learn how to skate? And they tell you.
That's right.
And then you go and you try. So this is that see it to be it. And I think this is where you're headed with the cultural availability, is if this is the stuff we got to focus on.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned the money thing. Again, another myth as far as I'm concerned, because if you look at the history of folks playing hockey, just in Canada as an example, these were not wealthy white families. These were primarily rural, lower middle class families who, like you said, they rallied around their communities, and when kids loved the game, they made it happen. And I don't know of any family, regardless of socioeconomics, that when their kids want to do something, they find ways to do it, even if they have to, through their church, sell baked goods or whatever. People find their way to find ways to make their kids happy, regardless of socioeconomics. So it's a myth. The other thing is, if truly cost was a matter, why don't we have more affluent families of color playing the sport? The Black and brown community is not socioeconomically monolithic. We are not all poor.
Right.
And so if indeed this was truly the biggest barrier, why don't we have more affluent families of color consuming the sport? So obviously this cultural availability issue is something that's very real. Yeah.
Right. No, I agree. And I love that word. I use that now. And I haven't heard it before used, so I say I got this from you. So I'm going to give you that phrase. You coined the phrase, cultural availability.
I think we actually got it from the work that we did with Spike Lee and his group as they went around and talked to multicultural hockey fans a couple of years ago. So I'm gonna attribute it to Spike and his group.
Well, yeah. Well, that makes sense. I get it. I get it. So since you've been there at the NHL, what's the biggest challenge or the biggest change you've seen in the NHL community since you started working there? Like, you've been there 3 years. What's the biggest thing that you've seen change?
I think I have to say two big things because they're bookends for me. Clearly in any sport that we look at, change happens more readily and more rapidly when it's player led. And so that's where you get real acceleration when players are leading that. And what I have seen, particularly since this season of COVID and the racial pandemic,
right,
are players across the league standing up and using their platforms to become educated, to be better informed, and to be out front on social issues. And this is not part of what we have historically seen in hockey culture. So I am so encouraged by that. And I think there's no turning back. I really do think we have set ourselves on a trajectory that this is a movement, not a moment in the sport of hockey. So that's exciting. And keeping that momentum is important. We'll talk about that in a minute. The second and important thing is, when you think about organizational change, and I'm a student of organizational change, it requires both top down and bottoms up advocacy work. You can't just push from the top down, but you also can't just have a grassroots effort without making sure that those people in positions of power are also aligned and educated around your vision. And so I have been so happy to see leaders in our sport, owners, presidents, general managers, CMOs, wanting to be educated and stepping up and using their power platforms around change. And I think that, again, this is part of the movement as well. Starting with the commissioner, who has been extraordinarily supportive and leading from the front. I have said for years that the true test of diversity, equity, and inclusion becoming embedded in an industry is when the CEO is the chief diversity officer.
Wow.
Right? And that to me is really the way change happens. And I've said that to Gary. And he has led from the front, from the side, from the back. He has been a constant learner and listener. And he has used his platform of power to influence his colleagues and the owners of the organization. And again, this is not going to be change that happens overnight, but having that kind of structural framework in place is what's going to really make sure that when I'm gone and you're gone, that we've put the mechanisms in place for this to stand on its own for years to come, that it becomes part of the DNA of the sport of hockey.
Wow. I totally see that because, you know, playing hockey, I know it was that culture is an old boys culture where you don't say much, you do your job, you're humble, you don't, you know, you're not flashy, you don't, you know, you're not out there talking about your vision or whatever. It's the team first. So I have seen like that, as you said, the players like making a stance and saying, I stand for this.
Yes.
And not just Black players.
That's
Which for me, and not just players, it's coaches. And then you said it's organizations and Gary Bettman stepping up and taking stands. And I think this is the thing that's going to help move the needle and keep it, as you said, to be a movement, not a moment. And I love that saying. And I think you're right. I think this is the pivoting point for the NHL, and you're in charge here.
Well, let me also say this, because I think our audience needs to understand this. You know, all of the progress that we're making, it doesn't mean that we aren't going to have missteps. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to do something that somebody's not going to like. It doesn't mean that we're going to be operating at the pace that everybody thinks we should. We have a lot of pent-up demand in our sport, right? And so people have high expectations that when the floodgates open, that we should be rushing through. And I understand that. But having said that, people have to understand that we have to give ourselves this moment to really create a sustainable movement. And that means that there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. It's not the fun, and it's not the media worthy work, right? And so as an example, we have over the past 5 months spent hours in sessions initiated by the clubs to do what we call courageous conversations with their senior leaders, where we facilitate conversations. And we've done it now for over 18 of our clubs, invited by them. This is not something we force down their throats. This is something that they've called and said, Kim, we'd like you and your team to lead a courageous conversation. And this is having the uncomfortable discussions about things around race and privilege and unconscious bias so that people can become educated. Now, the media isn't going to report on that, but that's the change work that's going to create the environment for culture to thrive. And that's the real work. That's the day-to-day work. That's the shoulder to the wheel work. And that's the work that we are about.
Wow. So you talk about inclusion and diversity. You know, is this happening at, because I know one of your areas of concern is youth hockey. So I know you guys are doing it at the NHL level. What's the challenge at the youth level?
Yeah. So, you know, we have one of the early things that I noticed when I joined the league and I went around, you know, I in the first 18 months with the league, I visited 28 of our 31, soon to be 32 clubs. So I spent time on the road. And you know, in my experience, it's listening to the voice of the customer, understanding the customer before you start taking action. So I was out in the environment. And what we heard was that there weren't enough voices at the table of decision-making and change with the NHL. And people identified 3 areas where voices needed to be more authentic and transparent: players, youth hockey, and with fans, and how we engage in the stadiums. And so we put a structure in place 6 months ago, and it is now taken off, to put a council, an executive council, and 3 committees in place to bring more voices to the table around these areas of change. We got a player inclusion committee that's being led by PK Subban and Anson Carter, who's a former player. You know both of them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We have an executive inclusion council that is made up of owners and presidents, being led by Gary Bettman and owner Kim Pagula. And they are going to be accountable through metrics for the change. We've got a youth inclusion committee that's being led by Rob Knezerit and Jeff Scott, and partnering with the heads of Hockey Canada and USA Hockey, the CEOs of those organizations, so they can hear unvarnished feedback from parents and coaches and those in the youth hockey ecosystem around the change that's necessary in the youth space. And finally, a fan inclusion council, which is being led by Heidi Browning, our CMO, and the president of the Sharks, Jonathan Betcher, made up of broadcasters and marketing types and agents and CMOs that will be looking at how do we make the sport from a marketing perspective more culturally available? How do we ensure that the experience in the stadium for our current multicultural fan base, which is 25% of our current fans, not our fans in waiting, our current fans are people of color. How do we ensure that their experience in the stadiums today are free of bias and discrimination? So those committees are now underway, and it's just a rich body of insight and information that's being fed into the NHL, unlike anything before, so that we can make decisions based on a full 360 understanding of what the ecosystem wants from the sport in the future.
Wow, that's incredible. So this is all going on. So it sounds like you guys are dealing with all the stakeholders, right down to the bottom of youth hockey. Coaching,
that's right.
Get more coaches on board, the organizations, parents. No stone is being left unturned. That's amazing, and that's what I think needs to be done. Like it's got to be organizational alignment from the top down, and it sounds like the piece that you're incorporating or pouring in is the accountability piece.
Critical. Without accountability, there is no action, and accountability means setting targets, being clear about those targets and the achievement of those targets, and then holding yourselves accountable for that. And Gary has been very clear that it is the EIC's responsibility to set targets and to ensure through collaboration and influence that our 32 clubs, not the same way, because every market is different, but a set of precepts and principles that we all stand up, that we are executing those areas of importance consistently across all 32 clubs. And let me give you an example of what I mean by consistency. We're talking about hiring targets in the front office. So while there is a difference between the demographics, let's say in Edmonton versus Chicago, the concept is the same, that we should be looking at our demographics in these various locations and setting targets on how we're going to make those demographics more appealing across all the dimensions, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. So that's one area. Another area is what I call economic inclusion. How are we doing business with women and minority-owned organizations so that they are sharing in the economic prosperity of our game, from those organizations that provide services in the community to organizations that are law firms and accounting firms? How are we giving women and minority-owned business a piece of the economic pie as we are building the future of our sport? You know, how do we ensure that we build a pipeline of elite talent of color so that 20 years from now we have double the number of kids of color coming through the elite pipeline? So these are the areas of interrogation that we will be looking at across all these committees to ensure that the future of this sport 20 years from now, when I'm gone and you'll probably still be coaching, this is again part of the DNA of the sport of hockey. So
that was leading me to the next question. It's 2030. What does the new hockey community look like? Based on what you've told me, and it sounds like you just answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look up and you see more people that look like you and I at every aspect of the sport, from coaches, to executives, to players that are recognized. I mean, I think you look at someone like a Quentin Byfield,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, who you just came through the draft and is just amazing. You know, we will be seeing more Quentins. I hope that we will see a female professional hockey league. I'm very passionate about that, and expect with the work of the player inclusion committee, which includes women, by the way. Our player inclusion committee are all dimensions of folks, including women, so that we can properly represent the future of women's hockey as well. So, you know, my vision is that the sport of hockey reflects the communities where we live, and the communities that we serve. And we know those communities are changing every day.
Wow. So it sounds like you said, once this is all set up like this, and as we go through it, it's going to take time, we're going to have a different hockey community. And people are going to be forgetting about the, you know, it's only for these people, or the segregation, or whatever you want to call it. The systemic racism is going to be gone, because I understand there's a zero tolerance right now policy. You and Gary have said zero tolerance. If any of that stuff goes on, they're done.
It's absolutely true. And you know what we've learned from listening to all of these stakeholders is that everyone consistently, from the top of the organization, from players to those in the youth ecosystem, they identified the greatest threat to the future of our sport is youth hockey, and making youth hockey more accessible and welcoming. So this is a really, really important part of what we have to make sure we contribute as the North Star of the sport, contribute in changing.
So that's why that's one of your titles down, is taking care of youth sport in the grassroots level, because that's the future. So
that's the future.
Definitely the future. Kim, unbelievable. Let's start to wrap this up a little bit, but I've gotten so much great knowledge and from you today, and our audience. I hope they see, and I don't think they see, they can hear, feel your passion for what you've done. Incredible. You're an incredible woman, and a woman of color, woman, period. If you were going to leave the audience with three things that were in the hockey world, three things they could, focus on in their own community, what three things would you leave them with? Or it could be two things. Doesn't have to. But what message would you leave them with, right now? And I know I'm putting you on the spot, but what would you tell them right now? Because this program is about helping quality sports experience at the youth level. Coaching, parents. Like, what would you tell the audience?
First thing is what I said at the beginning. This is a journey. It's not an event. And we have to collectively continue to do our individual parts as leaders in our own spaces, to remove the barriers, to interrogate our own models of behavior and the ways in which we can make our sport more welcoming. So that's number one. Number two is, because it is a journey, cut ourselves some slack. Understand that as much as we know that there's much change to be made, measure change not from the point of where we start to where we need to go, but measure incrementally the progress that we're making along the journey path, because that's the thing that keeps you inspired and encouraged. And so continue to stop and reflect on not where we still need to go, because yes, we have a lot of work to do, but just periodically check in on what we have actually done to improve the sport and the mechanisms and structures that are being put in place, and celebrate that in our own ways. And thirdly, and most importantly, continue to bring kids of color to the sport. Find ways to introduce yourselves and your networks to one another, and let's create the kind of environment in hockey that supports the values and the principles of the sport that those that love the sport hold so dear. Let's make sure that those principles and those values apply uniformly to everyone. And where they don't, let's be the change that we seek.
Kim, you truly are a trailblazer. Thank you. Those are great points. Guys, thanks for tuning in today. If you are listening to this, share this. Anyone in the hockey world needs to listen to this. We're amongst greatness today, and you will be going down in history. I think so, at least in the history books, for helping change the game. So on that note, guys, thanks for tuning in. Just go play. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you so much.